I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. And welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I'm just so excited to be joined today by Dr. Alicia Grandey because you wrote a book. Hi, do you want to introduce yourself?
I wrote a book. Well, I didn't just by myself write a book. Yes, I'm Alicia Grandey. I am a liberal arts professor of psychology at Penn State University. And yeah, I wrote a book with my colleague, Dina Denham Smith.
And your book is called Emotionally Charged: How to Lead in the New World of Work. It's an awesome airplane book, by the way. That is the only time that I actually get to sit down and read physical books. And so it is perfect. It is, I think, the ideal airport book.
I wish that they would carry it at the airport bookstores, right?
Tell me about it, right? Like, especially the cover for, podcasting is an audio format, but the cover is like a bright yellow. I feel like it'd be very eye-catching in an airport. Well, hopefully we're going to be able to like peel back the curtain and see a little bit more about like the experience of writing the book and what went into it and some of your thought processes as you're writing it, because I think there's just so much to unpack, and I want to encourage our listeners to buy the book. And so I'm not trying to just recap it here. But, I think in reading the book, it seemed like one of the first aims was to address some myths and stigma around emotions at work and emotional labor. And so I was just curious, what would you say is or are the biggest myths, and why are they wrong?
Well, one is just what is emotional labor? And this is something that I just have a hard time with because I've been studying this topic we're going on over 25 years now. So I have a pretty firm sense of what it is, but it's such a cool topic and a cool name for a topic that it's kind of taken on a life of its own, let's say. So emotional labor in my vein, in my world, is performing emotions or regulating your emotions for the sake of your work role. So often that's service with a smile, but people in any kind of job do it. You're probably doing it right now, with your voice. But then it's become kind of this broader concept of any kind of work that is unrecognized, invisible, tends to not be compensated well, and often gendered. So that is also true of emotional labor, but that is, that's a much broader concept. So one of the myths is that it's only done by women. And that is simply not true. And in fact, we wrote this book to speak to leaders in general who are disproportionately men. But so that means there's this huge audience that really needs to learn this stuff about emotional labor, about how they're doing it without even realizing it, the costs of it. And also, men tend to not be as socialized around emotions, around like healthy ways of showing and regulating their emotions as women in at least Western society. And so the book was really intended to kind of fill that niche of addressing, what do we believe and think emotions are there for? And so to answer your question, the biggest myth is probably that emotions are good or bad, that there are good emotions and there are bad emotions. And we want the good ones and we don't want the bad ones. And the problem with that is that emotions are information. And so if we ignore half the information that we have available to us, then we're not performing as effectively as we could be.
And all of that came through so clearly in reading the book. First, like the tonality of who you were writing for, it was obvious that like you guys had worked with people who had been resistant to the idea that emotions even belong in the workplace, especially like negative emotions, and sort of addressing some of these internal roadblocks and barriers up front around like, why am I even talking about this? Why should I care? And this idea that emotions are information and are valuable and can make you better at your job and are an expected part of the job in the context of like emotional labor, I think rang clear throughout the entire book. And I just really appreciated how it felt like, oh yeah, you've had this conversation with people, that those like internal like, this isn't for me, and like how to get around them in an effective way.
It even happened this morning. I was at a doctor's appointment and the person at the counter had a tough time. Like there was stuff going on. It was really busy. And I told her what I did and about the book. And she's like, I've never heard of that. And there's something about naming your experience that is validating, right? So just having a name for the work that you're doing and the effort you're putting in and realizing it's not your fault if you're exhausted, that it's normal and it's natural for it to be tiring and maybe related to burnout. And also maybe we need some strategies and skills to do it better because it's part of your job. I mean, all of that I think is very helpful for any employee. But yes, we wrote it mainly for leaders who may have less access to this information.
Well, and that reminds me of one of the takeaways in your book is like naming your emotions can like help you experience them, deal with them, use them better. And that was just like one of the many practical tools and suggestions. You talked about like how to support an employee going through a crisis, how to prep for a difficult conversation. And I'm just wondering from your end, because there are so many like practical tools, obviously you're thinking leader, but generally anyone, could you picture the person reading your book and how they're going to use it? Like, is there a movie in your head of people out there using your book, and what does it look like?
That's a really interesting question. I think I was picturing like my male colleagues, perhaps. And I know that Dina, who is an executive coach, works a ton with CEOs of all stripes and all types of businesses, as well as other levels of leadership and management. We might have been picturing slightly different people, but I think we were both picturing people in these male dominated roles who maybe think that the best way to deal with emotions is either to not have them or not show them. And that is, again, one of those myths that we just needed to overcome. And in fact, we cite some studies showing that leaders who actually express their emotions are seen as better leaders, are rated as more effective leaders. And that is, exactly the point. This is a part of the workplace. And the other thing is like, if your employees are not experiencing emotions and you're not experiencing emotions at work, that probably means you don't care very much about your job. That's not good, right? We know we want worker engagement. And if you're engaged, that means things matter to you. And that means things are threatening when things go poorly. And that means you have emotions about them. So that just means things matter. And that's what you want in your workplace and in your employees and in yourself.
Yeah, so much of this book was really internally helpful for me. I thought, I like to think of myself as like self-aware. I've done the work. I study this. And as I was going through this, I was like, oh no, like this is me. Like I will leave a faculty meeting where I got like a little overly passionate and then felt really embarrassed about being like frustrated in a meeting. And then, reading this book, I was like, oh no, it's just because I care. And that's actually like a good thing. Maybe there's different ways to like show it that are more effective or like plan ahead. But, some of the negative emotions around having negative emotions really hit home. And I just thought that this was like a really valuable book, and in a way that it's more than just a one and done. I don't envision like having read this once, setting it down and never picking it back up again. It reminded me of a book that I read in preparation for my wife's birth of our first child, written by a doula. And I thought like, okay, great. I'm going to read this. I'm going to be ready. And then it was like, no. Like this is a book that you pack in the bag to go to the hospital. You whip it out and like use the exercises in there for the birth. And it felt like the exact same thing, but for the workplace and like these hard emotions and challenging situations of like, I'm going to pack this in my bag to go to the office. And like when I need reminders of how to handle the situation, I can look back at those practical tools that you included that were really helpful.
I love that, Keaton. That means a lot to me. And absolutely. And in fact, it reminds me of what I always say when I start doing a workshop on this topic, which is, hey, y'all, I've been studying this for over 25 years. I still don't have it figured out. Like nobody does this perfectly. We're all practicing these skills, right? And so I'm not going to have the magic bullet. I'm not going to have the secret that's going to mean you don't ever have problems with your emotions ever again. The point is that we're works in progress. And if we have these strategies and these tools and we know ourselves a little bit better around this, we can work better with them. But absolutely, as I was writing the book, I learned so much. And that's great. I mean, science is an unfolding and ongoing dynamic process. So we got the most recent evidence in there. And I was grateful for it as well. And in fact, I was going through a really difficult time myself. So was my co-author. So we were putting it to use. Every time we would have our check-in meetings about how the book was going, we would spend the first quarter of that hour-long phone call just going through what's going on in our lives, how are we doing, and trying to practice what we were preaching. And it was helpful. Who knew?
Yeah, there's so much there. I do want to know some behind the scenes as you're, immersing yourself in this literature, which is so clear. Like it comes through that this is very like scientifically grounded, but also incredibly accessible. Like I thought about like handing this to friends who like don't have a PhD in psychology, but like knowing that they could get out of it the same thing that I did. But as you were writing it and like working with it, it sounds like it was really valuable for you. What was like the most important thing? Like if you could name one that you learned while you were writing it.
Well, I'm going to name two. So one is process and one is content. Okay. So, process wise, I learned that academics are really bad at writing accessible books. So that's me, right? So, the way this process worked, you started with that, right? Like, what's the process? So Dina has written a lot for like Harvard Business Review and Fortune and Fast Company, and so she knows, like, and she's talking to leaders all day long. She knows how to communicate clearly, but she's got an MBA, she's got a master's in IO psychology, so she knows the science, but she mostly knows how to communicate and how to listen. So she would start with just like, here's some main points I think we want to make in this chapter based on my work and what I know and the people that I'm dealing with and what their problems and issues are. Like we started with that. And then I would read it and be like, oh, yeah, we have some science to back that up. Oh, here's a study. Oh, actually, this study counters what you were saying. So let's improve on that so it's more accurate. And then she would take what I had written, Keaton, and rewrite it so that it was actually accessible and fun to read. And we have all these toolkits and learning points, and we try to use fun acronyms to make it more memorable. But that is so much Dina and her skills and her gifts. I brought the science, but she really communicated. And I'm glad to hear it came through clearly to anyone. But then to answer your question about content, I think the biggest thing for me, because some of this stuff is just hard to do and it's ongoing practice, like recovery. Like I know I need to recover, I need to take breaks. Okay. But the one that was the biggest surprise was the value of emotional acceptance. So, I've studied for years, you shouldn't suppress your emotions, right? And there's so much evidence that that is not good for our health. It's not good for our relationships. It's not good for our performance. Just holding it all in is just difficult and bad for our bodies in so many ways. But I thought the good form of regulating our emotions, again, not good or bad emotions, but regulating our emotions, the good way to do it was reappraisal, right? Which is the cognitive approach, where you just think about things differently and take different perspectives. What I learned was that there is more recent evidence really highlighting the value of just accepting these emotions are real, that they're valid information, not feeling guilty or bad about how you're feeling, as you mentioned, right? Feeling guilty about being upset or passionate in the meeting. That's not helpful. And so, like you said, you just accept, wow, I guess that was really important to me. I can see how I'm feeling. My body's telling me something. And now I can do something with that more objectively. And that step is really hard to just accept this is information my body's giving me and accept it without judging it and sitting with it. It's uncomfortable. And it is where all the good learning and then being able to act effectively happens. So that was the biggest thing to me. It was like, wow, I really need to work on that.
Oh, I love that. I think just, reading this book in the best way possible felt like a therapy session of it's like no matter where you're at in your life, it felt like it'd be relatable because we all have those trying emotional experiences and we've, tried what's already in our toolkit and it still isn't working. And that's not just a one and done. And it's not just in the workplace. It's not just leaders. It's, I think, accessible to anyone. And so I just, the idea like exactly of emotional acceptance or a lot of the other tools that you brought into the book, by the end, I was like, oh my gosh, like I feel like I have a new perspective on this thing that I'm working through as I'm reading this book, even though it's not related to work or whatever.
Well, it's so much of it, right? So much of what we're dealing with when we have emotions at work is actually not about the work, right? Some of it is, but some of it is what we're dealing with at home or elder care or child care or personal health or the state of the world, right? And so, yeah, it was a lot about that too. Just what do we bring to work? And the fact that it felt like therapy is, I'm glad. And in fact, we were trying to make it clear that therapeutic thing of it's not your fault. Like don't blame yourself if you've had trouble regulating your emotions, or don't blame yourself that you're burned out. It is a valid way to feel if you haven't been given the tools. We don't tend to prioritize these emotional skills in leader training and leader development, right? It tends to be a lot more cognitive, a lot more about the finances. It's not your fault if you didn't know how to use this effectively or use emotions effectively or express yourself clearly. It takes practice. And the first step is accepting that you have a problem, right? That's the first step. And then not blaming yourself, but just starting there with what's the first step I can take. And we try to give some very simple, very clear first steps for wherever you start from. And everyone's going to start at a different place.
I think, again, going back to your process part of this, the grounding in science for those first steps, for that practice, was just so incredibly clear and so accessible. Like, one of my favorite examples was the 3 C's of psychological needs. As I was reading it, I was like, oh, self-determination theory, like, got it. And I was like, I had never thought of it as like an easier acronym. I had learned it, and that's not accessible. And what I call it is not accessible to, the random person on the street or the person behind the counter at the doctor's office. And so I know you said that you and Dina had like gone back and forth, and I'm just curious about, how did you thread that needle of, oh, okay, I feel like that maybe we've gotten too far from the science, or this is actually like too heavy in the research and not accessible? What did that look like?
Well, again, Dina is a wonderful, very kind, but very clear about accessibility. And that was number one goal. So like we had two goals going into this book. One was to rekindle our friendship. I mean, we were grad student buddies, like besties in grad school. And then she left after her second year to get her MBA and went on to her amazing career. And that was like 30 some years ago. Like we just celebrated our 30th year of friendship. So number one was like, let's do something together, and in a way that's, merging our skills. And number two was we want to write a book and get that book in the hands of the people who need it, right? We don't want to just write a book because we want to write a book. We want it to be something useful, and we want to get it out there so that people can actually use it. So the way it looked was I would add some science and make sure that what she was saying was accurate, because she can say things really clearly, but they weren't always embedded in the science that I'm more current day with. And then we would revise it, but always come back to like, what is going to be interesting to read? What is going to be easy to read? We're not dumbing it down. And I want to be very clear. That is not what we're doing. We're making it more memorable. It's not even simplifying it. It's like you said, like instead of SDT and the 3 things of self-determination theory, it's like, oh, these all could start with C. That makes it so much simpler. Or DARE. So we come up with this acronym DARE in order to talk about recovery experiences. Well, Sabine Sonntag, who came up with these 4 dimensions in her work, she didn't call them DARE, but that is an accurate representation of detachment, autonomy, rest. And we just, instead of mastery, we call it in empowering or engaging yourself in things and activities. So we're not changing the science, and we're not making it less than or simpler. We're making it more readable and more memorable so you can actually use it.
Yeah, it was so comforting to read essentially like a self-help book that wasn't just someone's vibes. Like, it was very clear that like, oh no, these are literally best practices supported by 100 years of science and the most recent and current up-to-date science and expertise that, I don't know, it is not common in a lot of these books around how to be a better leader. Having read many of them now, just sort of as a passion project. And so I thought that, it's a really cool skill set that we could all work on from both sides of the spectrum of making sure that the advice that we're giving is rooted in the science, but then also that the science that we're doing is accessible on the front end, and maybe putting a little bit of extra effort on that front end to make sure that it is memorable, it is accessible to, the audience. Because I'm reading a journal article at 2 a.m. with like no sleep. It would be easier for me if that was memorable in the first place.
Yeah, you're describing exactly what we realized we had that was special and cool, which was, we talk a lot in our field about the science practice gap, but also how we should all be scientist practitioners. It's really hard for one person to do both really well. They're different skill sets, they have different goals, different timetables. I mean, Dina made it very clear when we started this project. She's like, we are writing this book in a year. That's it. And for me, I'm like, oh, every journal article takes like 2 to 4 years, right? Like, she's like, no. So, so much is different that it makes sense that a partnership is really what's needed. And I know, our former Penn State students, Katina Sawyer and Patricia Greberick, just wrote a book together, and they're also a science practice blend. It's super smart. I think it just makes so much sense. Instead of expecting one person to be able to do it all, let's work with the other person. And also, it's not just adding the science to what's easy writing. It's the practitioner is listening to what people need. And I feel like as scientists, we're not really rewarded for doing that. We're rewarded for coming up with something that's a novel idea or that solves a theoretical problem, but we're not actually like talking to managers saying, "Hey, what's the biggest problem you're facing right now, and how can I help?" Right? And that's what she really brought that was, I think, really made the book very, very valuable.
Yeah, when the anecdotes that you had from leaders of different levels that were throughout the chapters, but especially ones that started the chapters, like made it very clear, like, oh, this is a practical, real world book. Not that I needed the buy-in, because again, like as you're reading, you're like, oh, I can use this right now for me, for what I'm going through. But like that it very clearly derived in at least part from the need that's arising through practice. And like I like how present you and Dina were as authors throughout the book of talking about your experiences, and how you wrote the book. Even in the book is very meta and very cool, and felt like a conversation with you, and that you were present and holding my hand as I read the book, and like, here's why we're doing this. I did have one question, because the self-assessments, as I mentioned, like caused me to do some major introspection. And again, from like a science practice perspective, I thought that they really blended that well. And how did you make those? Where did they come from? What's going on with these self-assessments? They're so useful, but what's going on behind the scenes?
So a lot of them are from the science. Some of our colleagues in IO Psych have done some great intervention research, right? Where they've done daily diary interventions of asking people to have a certain mindset and then seeing if it makes a difference in that day's leadership, or doing like a compassion intervention and compassionate leadership and how that looks. So we were often using what the interventions were in the assessments or in the toolkits. So they're actually from the science. And we're, of course, citing the authors that created these tools. Sometimes we took things and we made them a little bit more interesting, but they're always starting with what are the measures and tools that have been used and validated in the science? And then how can we make them accessible for this audience and in a way that isn't too wonky or wordy. Obviously, in IO Psych, we're always asking the same question 3 times at least. So we have reliability of measures and all that. And we just, we don't need to do that for a self-assessment tool. So it was really grounded in the basics, in the existing science. But we also looked at it, like you said, meta, like, would we want to do this? Like, would we want to do this activity? Would our parents, would our colleagues, would our partners? And if we say no, then we got to change it.
There's the negative emotions, or the negative attitudes towards emotions, and the emotion differentiation scales. Right next to them in the book, I've written like, woof. did not do good, especially on the emotion differentiation one, which I thought I was going to nail. I was like, oh, I got this. And then did not. And it's really interesting to hear that they are rooted in the science, because like, again, they were so accessible. That's like, I wonder if they just made these up.
Well, the one, so you're talking about the one where it's like envy and jealousy are not the same thing. And
yes. Yeah.
so that's something that it can feel a little nerdy, right? And my friends certainly don't like it if I correct them when they use these words wrong. So I don't try to do that. But if we have a shared meaning, if you think envy means one thing and I know it to mean something else, then you telling me you're envious can really land differently. And the same with the other emotions that we talk about. And compassion versus pity, like, that's huge. Nobody wants to be pitied, but they want to receive compassion, right? How do those look different? Those were really more based in how do the scholars that study each, some scholars, they study one emotion, and that's like what they study for decades. So we're basing it in that kind of decades of research experts, but then putting it all in one place for us to learn.
It was awesome. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that your book also is very forward thinking, especially around, you've got a chapter on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in the context of emotions and emotional labor. You have a chapter on technology and how that interfaces. And I thought that was very, it feels both timeless and very timely, of we're struggling to decide which emoji to put in an email to convey the right emotion, but also that idea of how do I convey the right emotion to the person I'm talking to is a forever issue. And so I'm curious, again, especially with those two forward-thinking topics, what was that like writing those chapters?
I'll back up and say the whole book, it takes a while to get to the point of it actually being published. And so when we started the book, just the conversations around the book and talking to the publisher, it was, post COVID, like that was the focus. And so we had a lot of language about pandemic and about reactions to the pandemic. And then we realized we really wanted it to be more evergreen and that was going to be kind of dated by the time the book came out. Right? Everyone's kind of like, let's move on, right? So that was the first thing we did, was really be like, no, this is, while the pandemic certainly maybe kickstarted some of these tensions, like the need for leaders to be more attentive and more available to talk about mental health issues. I think that came from the issues that people were facing during the pandemic, the realization that we've all gone through trauma together, right? So some things were rooted in the pandemic, but these are evergreen topics. The way we're communicating them, right, which is the technology piece, or the things that we're maybe experiencing emotions around, may ebb and flow depending on the work context and the time that we're in. So those two chapters were based in that. And again, we're very aware, Dina particularly, about what the pulse is in organizational life. She saw the writing on the wall with the kind of kickback or reactiveness to diversity as a topic. And so it was like, okay, we want to be honest and we want to still include this chapter. We're not going to take it out. We want it to, again, not create reactivity. We want it to be a learning opportunity that can work for any form of diversity. So it's not just focused on certain groups. It's about any kind of differences that can be present in your team and how to manage any conflict that can come because people think, feel, look different ways. And then technology, of course, is always changing. And so you can't talk about any specific technology. So it's more just thinking broadly about, like, what if we can't see each other? What if we're not in the same physical space, right? And those are evergreen, while the way that we're communicating through technology might differ, right? Which tool we're using might differ.
Yeah, it was so interesting reading, especially the diversity part where you're like, as we were writing this, the pendulum's swinging backwards. And I was like, well, since you wrote it and like when I'm reading this, the pendulum continued to swing backwards. And what strong foresight you had as writing that. So, no, absolutely. Are there any key takeaways or thoughts that you want to leave us with?
We've done a lot of thinking about this so that we have something to give people when they leave our workshops or our talks, right? Because it's a lot of information. It can feel overwhelming. So we actually kind of walked through these, Keaton, during this conversation. So number one is that leading and working in most jobs today requires emotional labor. You don't maybe know it, but it does. Number two is that emotions are information. It's not good or bad, but it is telling you that something matters to you. And it's important to listen to it, or if you ignore it, you're going to face the consequences. Number three is that suppressing is not an adaptive strategy, right? There's lots of costs. We didn't get into all those costs, but there's decades of research that just suppressing and holding it in is bad for your health, your relationships, and your performance. Number four is that just to regulate your emotions, the weird jujitsu-like thing that you should probably do is to accept that they are real. The emotional acceptance is this key thing. You can do that by breathing, recognizing what's going on in your body, then accepting them cognitively, verbalizing them to get them out, and then move forward. And that's the acronym BRAVE. Breathe, recognize, accept, verbalize, and engage. And the last one is you've got to dare to overcome the burnout that we're experiencing. This is the recovery paradox of when we most need a break, we're least likely to take one. You got to dare to do it. And that's, again, you got to detach from work, autonomy of choice of what you do and your activities, rest, get your body back to baseline, and empower yourself as more than just an employee. Do things that are outside of your work role to feel like a whole person again.
I love that. I have one final question for you. Why do you do this work broadly?
I have to say that research is me search. I mean, I've always been interested in emotions because I myself struggle with them. I have always been the kind of person that feels them strongly. They come to the surface easily. I'm very curious about how I'm feeling, how other people are feeling. I'm always reading the room. When I teach, I'm like scanning everybody's face to see where we're at, are people interested or bored? So it's something that I have both been intrigued by, but also challenged by. And so I have the privilege of having a job that allows me to pursue that challenge and interest with my research. And then beyond that, realizing when I would talk to people about my research on emotional labor or on diversity related topics, people are like this morning at the doctor's office, people are like, oh, that's me. I could use that book. I mean, that is so rewarding, right? To realize that you're sharing and working on something other people resonate with and can learn and grow from, it is a gift to keep on doing this work where people can learn from it and grow from it. So that's why I keep doing it.
I love that. And so people can find your book certainly on bookshop.org, and I imagine other like online retailers. Any other preferred places for them to look for your book or your work?
It's available through Oxford. We have a percentage off coupon from Oxford.
I can include it in the show notes.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for writing this book.
Thank you, Keaton. I appreciate you having me on, and I'll tell Dina you said hi.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.
Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher, and our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use, and please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.